What if the most famous children in California were never seen by the people who should have seen them most? That question sounds reckless, even unfair. It's the kind of sentence you hesitate to say out loud because once it exists, it can't be taken back. And yet, over the last several weeks, versions of that question have been whispered quietly in one of the most discreet neighborhoods in America. Not shouted, not posted, sometimes with an awkward laugh at the end, sometimes followed by a long pause. Here's the contradiction that makes this story unavoidable right now. The Sussexes are among the most photographed, litigated, analyzed public figures on the planet. And yet, according to multiple people who live near them, there are parts of their daily reality that no one locally seems able to confirm. Not because of secrecy, not because of gates or guards, but because of absence. I want to slow this down before we go any further, because stories like this collapse when they're rushed. This is not a clip show. It's not a montage of accusations stitched together for outrage. This is about patterns, gaps, timing, and a moment, a very specific moment, when something quietly shifted. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It starts, strangely enough, at midnight. According to multiple accounts circulating privately in Montecito, Prince Harry left the family home late at night abruptly and without the kind of visible coordination you'd expect from a household that lives under constant security protocol. No announcement, no public explanation, no carefully placed counter-narrative the following morning. Just gone. Now, if this were an isolated incident, it wouldn't mean much. People leave homes late at night all the time. But in this case, the timing collided with something else, a low-level hum of questions that had already been building quietly for months. Questions that didn't begin with divorce, and didn't begin with scandal. They began with something far more uncomfortable. Why don't we ever see the kids? That question is not coming from internet forums or hostile commentators. At least, not originally. It's coming from neighbors, from parents who see other celebrity children at school drop-offs, from service workers who notice routines, from people who live in a place where privacy is respected, but patterns are still noticed. And the way this question emerges is important. No one says it confidently at first. It usually comes wrapped in self-doubt. Maybe they're just very private. Maybe they travel more than we think. Maybe we just miss them. That's how the mind protects itself from uncomfortable conclusions. You supply reasonable explanations. You assume the most benign version of reality. Until, slowly, the explanations stop covering the gaps. Here's why this matters now, not historically. For years, the Sussexes have framed their California life as a sanctuary, a carefully constructed escape from the surveillance culture of royal life, a place where their children could grow up normally, safely, without cameras, without intrusion. That framing has been consistent, repeated, defended. But what happens when the place designed to be normal becomes strangely blank? What happens when the people physically closest to that normal life can't describe it? I want to be very clear about what we're doing here. We are not asserting that the children do not exist. We are examining why multiple people in the same physical environment are privately saying the same thing, that they've never seen them, never heard them, never observed routines that typically surround children, even in households that value privacy. That distinction matters, because this story is not about proving a claim. It's about understanding why the claim exists at all, and why no one has decisively shut it down. If this were a simple rumor, it would be easy to extinguish. A photograph, a school confirmation, a casual sighting, something unplanned, something uncurated. Instead, what we've seen is a continuation of controlled imagery, carefully selected moments released at precise times, and a conspicuous absence of spontaneous confirmation. That absence is what's driving the unease. And then there's the marriage. For a long time, public speculation about the Sussex marriage has followed a familiar arc: tension, resilience, unity against the world. Any signs of strain were framed as external pressure. Any silence was framed as dignity. But lately, the silence feels different. It's not defensive, it's procedural. Separate appearances. Shifting priorities. Advisors appearing in the background who don't typically show up unless something is being prepared. None of these details confirm divorce, but together they suggest movement, quiet movement, which brings us back to that midnight departure, because when people leave at midnight, it's rarely symbolic. It's practical. It's about avoiding attention, about moving before questions can form. And here's the part that doesn't sit right with the neighbors who've been talking. The departure didn't come with the usual signals of family logistics. No visible coordination involving children. No ripple effects in the neighborhood the next day. No sense of disruption. It was as if only one person left. Again, not proof, but a data point. And when you stack enough data points without explanations, people start filling in the blanks themselves. Let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if only to yourself. If the most famous couple in your town lived 3 streets away, and you never once saw evidence of children over the course of years, not at school, not at the park, not at events, not even indirectly, how long would it take before you noticed? Not before you accused, just before you noticed. Because noticing is human, and once you notice, silence becomes loud. What complicates the story and what makes it so delicate is that there are powerful incentives for everyone involved to maintain ambiguity. Confirming too much exposes vulnerabilities. Denying too aggressively invites scrutiny. And so the safest option becomes a kind of strategic quiet. But strategic quiet only works if no one else is talking. And people are talking now. Not on record, not publicly, but consistently. There's another contradiction here that's impossible to ignore. This is a couple that has spent years insisting on their right to tell their own story. And yet, on this issue, perhaps the most fundamental element of that story, there's an unusual reluctance to provide clarity. Why? Is it because the story is more complex than it appears? Or because clarity would collapse carefully maintained boundaries? Or because something is in motion that hasn't finished moving yet? This is where seasoned reporting requires restraint. The temptation is to jump ahead, to connect dots aggressively, to turn unease into certainty. That's not what we're doing. We're mapping the unease itself. Because unease has origins, and those origins are almost always rooted in timing. The timing of the midnight departure, the timing of the silence, the timing of shifting legal and professional alignments, the timing of neighbors beginning to ask questions they once dismissed. None of this proves anything on its own, but together, it tells us one thing with confidence. Something is off-pattern. And off-pattern behavior in public figures doesn't usually resolve itself quietly. It either snaps back into place or it breaks open. What makes this moment especially volatile is that it sits at the intersection of 3 narratives that cannot coexist forever: the narrative of domestic normalcy, the narrative of complete transparency when it suits. At some point, one of those narratives gives way, and when it does, the consequences won't just be personal. They'll be structural, because this isn't just about a family. It's about credibility, about trust, about the limits of narrative control in a world where absence is as observable as presence. So as we move forward, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to declare conclusions before the evidence appears. We're not going to sensationalize children. We're not going to collapse complex questions into cheap answers. What we are going to do is follow the pattern, slowly, carefully, and examine why so many people, independently of one another, are sensing the same dissonance, and why that dissonance reached a breaking point at midnight. Because when someone leaves in the dark, it's rarely because nothing is happening. It's because something already has. That's the question that kept coming up when people in Montecito tried to make sense of what they thought they saw, or more accurately, what they didn't. Midnight isn't symbolic to the people who live there. It's practical. It's when things happen that aren't meant to be noticed, and that's why this night refuses to fade into the background. According to several accounts shared privately among neighbors and service workers, the departure wasn't theatrical. No convoy, no visible disruption, no lights flooding the street, just movement, quiet, purposeful. The kind of movement that feels rehearsed not because it's dramatic, but because it's efficient. Here's what makes that unsettling. High-profile households don't move casually. They coordinate. They announce indirectly. They create noise to control the absence. This time, there was none. When Prince Harry allegedly left the Montecito property late at night, the reaction afterward wasn't confusion, it was hesitation. People noticed something had happened, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud, because saying it out loud forces the next question. Why then? And maybe more importantly, this chapter isn't about proving the departure happened, it's about why so many independent observers describe the same thing in the same way. The phrasing is remarkably consistent. Words like quiet, sudden, off hours, no ripple. Those aren't tabloid adjectives. They're observational ones. One neighbor described it to me this way, not as an exit, but as a subtraction. Something was there, and then it wasn't. no visible replacement, no compensating presence the next day. And that's where the story starts to shift. Because in Montecito, life is patterned. Trash days, school schedules, dog walkers, security rotations, even privacy has a rhythm. When something breaks that rhythm, it stands out precisely because everything else is so controlled. The morning after the alleged departure, nothing adjusted. No increased security posture, no signs of family travel, no sense that a household was suddenly operating in a new configuration. Think about that for a second. If a family with young children relocates, even temporarily, it leaves traces. Staff schedules change. Vehicles move differently. There's a lag. A settling. But this wasn't a settling. It was a void. And voids don't announce themselves. They just sit there unanswered until someone trips over them. People did. A gardener, a delivery driver, a neighbor who walks the same loop every morning. None of them claim certainty. That's important. What they describe instead is misalignment. What they expected to see didn't match what was happening. And expectations don't form in a vacuum. They form over time. This is where timing becomes critical, because this night didn't occur in isolation. It landed after months of quiet discrepancies, things that didn't quite add up but were easy to dismiss individually. A neighbor mentioned that the house often felt static, not inactive, lights on, security present, but no signs of life changing. No weekends that looked different from weekdays. No seasonal shifts that suggested children aging, growing, becoming louder, messier, more visible. Again, none of this proves anything, but it explains why the midnight departure didn't feel random to the people who noticed it. It felt like punctuation. And punctuation changes how you reread the sentence. There's another detail that keeps surfacing in these conversations, and it's subtle enough that it would be easy to overlook. The departure wasn't followed by reassurance, not public, not private. No casual confirmation through community channels. No, they're traveling explanation that naturally circulates in tight-knit areas. Silence filled the gap. Silence can mean many things. It can mean discretion. It can mean respect. But it can also mean uncertainty or negotiation. Here's where seasoned reporting requires a pause, because the most dangerous assumption to make right now is that silence equals guilt or deception. That leap is emotionally satisfying, but intellectually lazy. Silence is often a holding pattern, a way to keep options open while decisions are still being made. And that's what this night suggests more than anything else: decision-making in progress. Think about the mechanics of leaving at midnight. You're not just avoiding cameras. You're avoiding conversations. You're reducing the chance of being seen by people who would later have to reconcile what they saw with what they were told. It's not about secrecy, it's about control. Control of narrative, control of timing, control of who knows what and when. And control is most valuable when something is unstable. What's particularly striking is how quickly the story spread. Not publicly, but socially. The morning after, people didn't ask, "Did you hear?" They asked, "Did you notice?" That's a different kind of question. Did you notice? Assumes something observable occurred. It invites comparison, not confirmation. And the comparisons lined up. Multiple people described the same absence. Multiple people noted the same lack of follow-up activity. Multiple people expressed the same discomfort with how little there was to point to. That discomfort matters, because people who live near high-profile figures are conditioned not to speculate. They mind their business. They protect their own privacy by respecting others. For that norm to break, something has to feel significantly off. This is where the emotional undercurrent starts to matter more than the facts. No one I spoke to sounded excited. No one sounded vindictive. They sounded uneasy, as if they'd stumbled into a question they didn't want to hold. One person said something that stuck with me. It wasn't dramatic enough to be gossip. It was too quiet. Too quiet. That phrase keeps coming back, because drama announces itself. Quiet forces you to listen harder. Let's talk about what didn't happen next. There was no visible family regrouping, no narrative reset, no public-facing moment designed to re-anchor the image of domestic unity. In a media-savvy household, that absence is notable. When rumors begin to circulate, especially ones that cut close to identity, the standard response is containment, a photo, a statement, a friendly leak, something that reframes the story. Instead, nothing. And when nothing happens, people start building timelines instead of consuming headlines. They go back mentally. They recall past moments. They reevaluate earlier assumptions. Oh, that's why we never saw. Oh, that explains the schedule. Oh, that makes sense now. This is how narratives unravel, not through revelation, but through reassessment. The midnight departure didn't create suspicion. It activated memory. And once memory is activated, it's hard to turn it off. There's another layer here that's easy to miss if you're focused solely on the spectacle. Leaving at midnight doesn't just reduce visibility. Fewer witnesses, fewer variables, fewer people who might later contradict an official explanation. It's not dramatic. It's procedural, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. This wasn't reactive. It was planned. Planned doesn't mean sinister. It means deliberate. And deliberation suggests forethought, a sense that what came next would require flexibility. That flexibility could relate to travel, to legal consultation, to personal space, to something else entirely. But whatever it was, it required leaving quietly. Here's the part where I want to slow us down again, because it's tempting to frame this as a story about a man fleeing. That word carries emotional weight, but fleeing implies panic. What people described didn't feel panicked. It felt resolved. Resolved to do something that couldn't be done in daylight. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you left your home at midnight for something that wasn't urgent or premeditated? Most of us can't think of many examples. Midnight departures are almost always tied to urgency, secrecy, or emotional necessity. Sometimes all three. And yet, even urgency leaves traces. Calls made, cars waiting, people adjusting. The absence of those traces is what keeps this night from settling into a neat explanation. Which brings us to the last detail of this chapter, and the one that shifts the story from curiosity to concern. No one noticed children leaving. No late-night packing. No small figures. No additional vehicles. No signs of a family in motion. Again, this doesn't mean the children weren't there. It means that whatever happened didn't look like a family departure. And that distinction is critical. Because if only one person left, the question becomes not where did he go, but that question hangs over everything that follows. It reframes the marriage. It reframes the silence. It reframes the neighbor's earlier unease about visibility. And it reframes the next chapter entirely. Because once people accepted that something had happened that night, even without knowing exactly what, they started paying closer attention to the environment around them. Not out of malice, out of instinct. What do people expect to see when they live near one of the most famous families in the world? Not paparazzi, not chaos, not constant spectacle. Montecito doesn't work like that. And that misunderstanding is part of why this story gets flattened online. The assumption is always that privacy equals invisibility, that gated communities are black holes, that wealth erases observation. It doesn't. What it does is change the way observation happens. Montecito is quiet, but it's not blind. People notice patterns here because there's so little noise to distract from them. Morning routines stand out. School calendars ripple through neighborhoods. Even households that fiercely guard privacy still leave behind signs of ordinary life, especially households with children. This chapter matters because it explains why the neighbors' unease didn't start with a rumor. It started with expectation. Expectation is built over time. It's the accumulation of small repeated experiences. Seeing the same faces at drop-off, hearing kids during certain hours, noticing backpacks in cars, bikes on driveways, the subtle chaos that comes with young families, no matter how wealthy or protected they are. When those things are missing, people don't immediately jump to conclusions. They hesitate. They rationalize. They assume they just aren't looking closely enough. Until they are, several Montecito residents described a similar progression. At first, the Sussex household blended into the background. Security presence? Yes. But that's common. High-profile residents aren't rare here. Actors, tech founders, executives. Their lives don't spill out onto the street, but they still leave traces. Children are the most traceable part of any household. One neighbor put it this way: you don't see the kids themselves. You see the aftermath. That line stuck with me because it captures the difference between privacy and absence. Kids don't need to be visible to be felt. Their schedules affect traffic. Their schools affect conversations. Their existence shapes the rhythms of the adults around them. In Montecito, school drop-offs aren't paparazzi events. They're mundane. Parents nod at each other. Security keeps distance. Life moves on. But in this case, there were no nods. People began to notice not because they were looking for something strange, but because something expected never materialized. Think about how long it takes for an expectation to fail loudly enough that you acknowledge it. Weeks? Months? In this case, it was years. And that's important. This isn't about a single missing sighting. It's about the accumulation of non-sightings. The quiet realization that no one independently could recall a moment where the children intersected with the community in any organic way. Not once. That doesn't mean they weren't there. But it does explain why the question eventually surfaced. What are we missing? The environment matters here. Montecito parents talk, not gossip. Logistics, schools, tutors, activities, calendars. Children connect adults whether they want to or not. And yet, the Sussex household remained oddly disconnected from those currents. No school chatter, no overlapping schedules, no indirect references, nothing that would anchor the children's presence to the community. One parent described it as like a house that's always occupied but never busy. That's a strange thing to say about a home with young children. Busy doesn't mean loud. It means changeable, unpredictable, messy in ways that don't announce themselves but still register. There's another detail that keeps coming up, and it's subtle enough that it wouldn't matter in isolation. The lack of adjustment. Most families, especially ones with children, alter their routines seasonally. Summer looks different than fall. Holidays shift traffic. School breaks change security patterns. Travel ebbs and flows. But multiple neighbors describe the Sussex property as unusually consistent. The same rhythms, the same quiet, the same controlled environment, regardless of time of year. Consistency is not suspicious on its own. But in family households, especially ones under stress or growth, consistency is rare. Kids grow. They get louder. They demand different things at different ages. None of that seemed to register externally. Again, no one drew conclusions at first. People gave the benefit of the doubt. They assumed extraordinary privacy measures. They assumed unconventional schooling. They assumed heavy travel. But assumptions have a shelf life. At some point, someone asked the question out loud. Not angrily, not publicly, just tentatively. Have you ever seen the kids? What's striking is how often the answer wasn't yes or no, but I don't think so. I can't recall. I might have, but those trailing sentences matter. They signal uncertainty, not accusation. And when uncertainty becomes collective, it changes shape. One neighbor described a moment at a community gathering where someone made a joke about never seeing the children. The laughter that followed was nervous, not amused. Because humor is often how people test taboo ideas. If the room shuts it down, you retreat. If it hums quietly, you realize you're not alone. That's what happened here. The room hummed. From there, the conversations became more careful, more private. People stopped joking and started comparing notes. Not to prove anything, but to reassure themselves that they weren't missing something obvious. They were hoping someone would say, "Oh yes, I see them all the time." No one did. This is the point where stories like this usually collapse under the weight of speculation. But what's notable here is the restraint. People didn't go to the press. They didn't post online. They didn't escalate. They waited. Because waiting suggests confidence that clarity will eventually arrive. What they didn't anticipate was that the waiting would coincide with something else. Growing distance between the couple. At first, that distance wasn't framed as marital strain. It was framed as logistics, work, travel obligations, all plausible, all normal. But as time went on, the distance felt less like scheduling and more like separation of worlds, separate appearances, separate narratives, separate emotional tones. And still, no anchoring presence of children in the local environment. This is where expectation becomes pressure. Because when a family presents itself publicly as grounded, domestic-rooted, and the surrounding environment doesn't reflect that, the gap invites scrutiny. Not aggressive scrutiny, cognitive scrutiny. People start reevaluating what they thought they knew. They revisit interviews, statements, photos. They ask themselves whether they mistook representation for reality. And that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable because it challenges not just the subject, but the observer. It forces you to question your own assumptions about visibility, trust, and how much you accept at face value. Let's talk briefly about schools, because this is where many online discussions get reckless. No one is claiming the children attend local public schools. That was never the expectation. Private education, homeschooling, alternative arrangements, all plausible. But even those choices leave footprints. Tutors arrive. Educational materials move. Schedules shift. Children's activities create patterns. Those patterns weren't evident, and when people asked indirect questions about schools in general, about local programs, the answers they received were vague, deflective, or non-existent. Again, vagueness isn't guilt, but repeated vagueness becomes noticeable, especially when contrasted with how openly other aspects of the Sussex narrative have been shared. There's a contradiction here that's hard to ignore, an insistence on telling one's own story, paired with a refusal to clarify its most basic elements when confusion arises. Why let the confusion grow? One explanation is that clarification would invite deeper scrutiny. Another is that the situation is genuinely complex. A third is that the narrative is still being negotiated internally. All three can be true at once. What makes Montecito unique is that people there don't need explanations to be convinced. They need alignment. When what they see aligns with what they're told, curiosity fades. When it doesn't, curiosity sharpens. And sharpened curiosity doesn't disappear on its own. By the time the midnight departure occurred, this underlying unease was already present. The night didn't create the question. It validated it. It told people subconsciously that something about this household was in flux. And when households with children are in flux, the children are usually the first thing you notice. Unless you can't. That's the part that keeps circling back in these conversations. Not accusation, not denial, inability. I don't know where they fit into the picture, one neighbor said. And that's what's strange. Strange doesn't mean sinister. It means unresolved. And unresolved questions have a way of accumulating gravity. As people began to look more closely at the environment, the comings and goings, the rhythms, the absences, they started noticing something else that hadn't registered before. It wasn't just the children who felt missing. It was the sense of a functioning family unit. And once that realization took hold, the story stopped being about sightings and started being about structure. Because when structure changes, it leaves traces. At some point, every community reaches the edge of a question it doesn't want to ask. Not because the question is dangerous, but because asking it changes the atmosphere. It forces people to confront the possibility that something foundational might be wrong, not just misunderstood, but structurally unclear. In Montecito, that moment didn't arrive with outrage. It arrived with hesitation. Someone finally said it plainly, without irony, without a punchline. Do the kids actually live there? Not shouted, not broadcast, just stated, quietly, in a conversation that immediately felt heavier for having crossed a line. This chapter isn't about the claim itself. It's about why the claim became speakable at all. Because in most neighborhoods, especially ones conditioned to mind their own business, that question would never surface. It would stay buried under politeness, under deference, under the unspoken rule that certain lives are off limits. What changed here wasn't respect. It was cognitive dissonance. The human brain is remarkably good at smoothing over inconsistencies. We do it constantly. We accept explanations that feel incomplete because pushing further would require effort, discomfort, or social risk. But when an inconsistency persists long enough, it stops being background noise and becomes a signal. That's what happened. People didn't arrive at the question suddenly. They backed into it, slowly, through repetition, through failed attempts to reassure themselves. They'd say things like, maybe they're just always traveling. Then someone would ask, but traveling where? For how long? They'd say, maybe they're older now, maybe routines changed. Then someone else would say, but even older kids have routines. Each explanation worked until it didn't. And when explanations stop working, the mind doesn't immediately accuse. It recalibrates. It starts asking better questions. One parent described the moment this way. It wasn't suspicion. It was confusion. And confusion gets louder over time. Confusion is uncomfortable because it demands resolution. You can live with uncertainty, but you can't live with contradiction forever. The contradiction here was simple, a family narrative that emphasized rootedness, safety, and normalcy, paired with an environment that reflected none of the usual markers of a family with children. And before anyone says it, yes, wealth and security change what's visible, but they don't erase it completely. Children leave fingerprints on the world. What's striking is how carefully people tried not to overstep. They didn't knock on doors, they didn't ask directly, they didn't probe staff. They asked sideways. They asked about schools generally. They asked about community events broadly. They asked other parents casually, and the answers, when they came at all, didn't cohere. No one seemed to know where the children went during the day. No one had a story that could be cross-checked. No one could say, oh, they're at this school, or they're usually with a tutor in the afternoons. The absence of shared knowledge is what elevated the question from curiosity to concern. Because in communities like Montecito, knowledge spreads organically, not through gossip, but through overlap, through casual recognition. I see them sometimes, they're usually with, they come by on. None of those fragments existed. Instead, there was a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty, they pull. Once the question was spoken, it changed how people listened. Past conversations were replayed mentally. Comments that once seemed irrelevant suddenly felt suggestive. Someone recalled mentioning children in passing to a staff member and being met with a correction that didn't clarify anything. Someone else remembered a moment when a neighbor asked about the kids, and the subject was redirected quickly, not defensively, but efficiently. Efficiency is not reassurance. Efficiency is containment. This is where the emotional temperature shifts, because when people sense containment around something that's supposed to be ordinary, they start wondering, why? Why contain something that should be self-evident? One resident said something that captures this perfectly. No one was trying to catch them in anything. We were trying to understand where the normal parts of life were. That distinction matters. This isn't about exposing a secret. It's about locating reality. And the longer reality remained elusive, the more people questioned their own perceptions. Am I imagining this? Am I missing something obvious? Is this just how they live? That self-doubt is important. It shows restraint. It shows an awareness of the limits of observation. But when multiple people experience the same self-doubt independently, and then compare notes, the self-doubt dissolves. What replaces it isn't certainty. It's alignment. Alignment around absence. There's another layer to this that makes the question especially uncomfortable. Children are not abstract symbols. They are living beings. To suggest uncertainty around their presence feels morally risky. People hesitate because they don't want to be cruel. They don't want to dehumanize. That hesitation kept this conversation private for a long time. But privacy has limits when confusion persists. At some point, silence stops being respectful and starts being evasive, even to the people who are silent. That's when the question becomes not is it appropriate to ask, but is it responsible not to? No one wants to be the person who ignored something obvious because it felt impolite. And here's the paradox. The more the Sussexes emphasized privacy around their children, the more they elevated the children's symbolic importance. They became central to the narrative of escape, healing, and purpose. Which meant that when their physical presence couldn't be located, the gap felt larger than it would have otherwise. If the children had been peripheral to the story, their absence might have gone unnoticed. But they weren't peripheral, they were foundational. Foundational elements demand confirmation, not spectacle, not exposure, just coherence. And coherence was missing. This is where things get especially delicate, because once people begin questioning existence, even in a theoretical way, the damage is already done, not because the question is true, but because it signals a collapse of trust in narrative alignment. People stop taking representations at face value. They start treating them as constructs, and constructs invite deconstruction. One neighbor admitted feeling uneasy even thinking the thought. It felt wrong to question it, they said, but it felt wronger not to. That tension between moral hesitation and cognitive discomfort is what pushed the question into the open. Not online, not publicly, but internally in the collective consciousness of the neighborhood. And once it was there, everything else was reinterpreted through that lens. Photos released publicly were no longer reassuring. They were scrutinized for context. Statements that mentioned the children felt abstract rather than grounded. The lack of incidental sightings, the kind that happened accidentally, organically, became more glaring. People didn't accuse. They analyzed. And analysis has momentum. There's also the issue of time. Children grow. Their needs change. Their presence usually becomes harder to hide, not easier, as they age. Which raises a question no one wants to articulate, but many are thinking, if the children are there, why hasn't their growing presence forced more visible adaptation? Why does the household still feel static? Static is not the same as calm. Static implies preservation. Maintenance, holding something in place. Families with children rarely feel static for long. They evolve. That lack of evolution is what keeps surfacing in these conversations. Not in a dramatic way. In a puzzled way. One person said, "It's like the house is frozen at a moment that never moves forward." That's a strange observation. And it's one that people don't make lightly. Here's where we need to pause again, because it's tempting to turn this into a binary. Either the children are there, or they aren't. Reality is often more complicated than that. There could be unconventional arrangements, long periods away, split residences, custodial complexities, educational decisions that isolate routines. All plausible. But plausibility isn't the same as clarity, and clarity is what's missing. What makes this even more destabilizing is the lack of corrective feedback. When communities misinterpret something, the misunderstanding usually resolves itself naturally. Someone clarifies, someone corrects, someone provides context. None of that happened here. Instead, the question lingered. And lingering questions metastasize. They start connecting to other observations. The midnight departure, the separation of schedules, the procedural silence. Suddenly, the question about the children wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern of opacity where transparency had once been promised. That promise matters, because when public figures position themselves as truth tellers, the threshold for trust is higher. Ambiguity feels more charged. People begin to wonder whether they were invited into a story that was never meant to be fully inhabited. That realization is unsettling not just because of what it suggests about the subjects, but because of what it suggests about the audience. Were we meant to believe something that couldn't be verified? And if so, why? This is the moment where a story like this could spiral, where speculation overtakes discipline. That's not where we're going. Instead, we're going to look at the next layer of information, the one that doesn't come from neighbors or casual observers. It comes from the systems that surround the household, because when visibility is tightly controlled externally, the pressure builds internally. And people who work within controlled environments notice different things. They notice inconsistencies not in sightings, but in operations, in routines that don't align with the story being told, in instructions that don't make sense unless something else is going on. And once those internal observations start surfacing, even indirectly, the question shifts again. It stops being where are the children and becomes what is being managed here, because management implies intent, and intent implies stakes. And stakes imply that whatever this is, it's not just about privacy anymore. It's about preservation. There's a difference between being unseen and being unseen by accident. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because it separates privacy from performance. One is passive, the other is engineered. By the time people in Montecito started questioning the absence of ordinary family markers, another realization crept in alongside it, quieter but just as destabilizing. The public had seen the children plenty of times, carefully, selectively, on cue, which raised a new contradiction. How can children be so visible to the world, yet so invisible to the place they're supposed to live? This is where the story takes a turn that makes many people uncomfortable, because it forces a confrontation with something we rarely like to admit. Not all visibility is the same. There's organic visibility, the kind that happens when life unfolds without choreography. And then there's controlled visibility, moments chosen, framed, released, and timed. The Sussex children exist publicly almost exclusively in the second category. Holiday cards, curated photos, carefully worded anecdotes, images that feel warm, intimate, domestic, and yet strangely unanchored to any recognizable environment. No accidental backgrounds, no neighboring landmarks, no incidental overlap with other lives, just enough to reassure. Never enough to locate. At first, most people don't notice this distinction because they aren't trained to. We consume images emotionally, not analytically. A photo of a smiling child does its job. It signals normalcy, safety, continuity. But when people who live nearby begin noticing a disconnect between representation and experience, those same images start to feel different. Not fake, strategic, and strategy implies purpose. Let's slow down here, because this is where nuance matters. Public figures have every right to protect their children from exposure. That's not in question. The issue isn't the presence of curated images, it's the absence of any uncurated ones. In a world saturated with cameras, total control is rare. Even the most guarded families experience leaks of ordinariness. A blurry sighting, a passing mention, a moment that wasn't designed for consumption. Those moments create credibility because they aren't perfect. What people in Montecito began to realize is that nothing about the Sussex children's public visibility felt accidental. It felt sealed. Sealed narratives can work until they collide with physical reality. Here's where the neighbor's perspective becomes crucial again. They aren't looking at press photos and asking, "Are these real?" They're asking, "Why doesn't this connect to anything we see here?" One resident described it as watching a show that claims to be filmed locally, but never recognizing the scenery. "It's like they live everywhere and nowhere at the same time," they said. That feeling didn't come from cynicism. It came from trying to reconcile two parallel realities. Reality 1, global visibility, emotional storytelling, repeated references to family life in California. Reality 2, a physical environment that shows no trace of that life intersecting with anyone else's. Those two realities can coexist briefly. Over time, they grind against each other, and when they do, people start looking more closely at how stories are constructed. This is where controlled visibility becomes more than a PR tactic. It becomes a structural feature of the narrative. Think about how the children are mentioned publicly. They're often referenced in symbolic terms: what they represent, what they deserve, what they're protected from. They are central to arguments about safety, trauma, generational change. But they're rarely anchored to daily life. You hear about what the children mean, not what they do. That abstraction is subtle but powerful. It allows the children to function as emotional pillars without requiring tangible confirmation. For a long time, that worked, until people noticed that abstraction wasn't just rhetorical. It was environmental. Even households that homeschool or travel extensively tend to leave some imprint on their surroundings. Tutors arrive, playdates happen discreetly. Families integrate quietly. None of that was visible here. And again, the point isn't that people expected access. It's that they expected residue. Residue is unavoidable when children are present. What replaces residue in this case is image management. The more people noticed that, the more they began to re-examine public appearances through a different lens. Photos that once felt candid now felt staged. Not in a sinister way, in a professional way. Lighting, angles, timing, context. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But when staging becomes the only mode of visibility, it stops feeling supplemental and starts feeling compensatory. Compensating for what? That question leads us somewhere uncomfortable, so let's approach it carefully. There are several plausible explanations for why the children might not intersect with the local environment in typical ways. Extended stays elsewhere, rotating residences, custodial arrangements that don't align with public assumptions. All of those could be true, but if they are, why not say so? Why maintain the impression of a rooted family life in Montecito while avoiding any organic confirmation of it? That's where intent becomes harder to ignore. Because maintaining a specific impression requires effort. It requires consistency across platforms. It requires discipline. It requires suppressing incidental contradictions. Which brings us back to control. One former acquaintance described the situation as living in a bubble that's carefully pressurized. Bubbles can protect. They can also distort. The distortion here is subtle but cumulative. It doesn't scream deception. It whispers dissonance. And dissonance is exhausting. For the people living near the household, it creates a low-level cognitive strain. They don't want to think about it, but the mismatch keeps reasserting itself. For the audience consuming the narrative globally, the strain manifests differently. It shows up as a vague sense that something doesn't quite line up, without being able to articulate why. That vagueness is dangerous for credibility because it doesn't provoke immediate backlash. It erodes trust slowly. Now add another layer, the adult's visibility. Both members of the couple have been seen separately more frequently in contexts that emphasize autonomy rather than family unity. Solo engagements, solo travel, solo narratives. That doesn't prove separation, but it reinforces the impression that the family unit as a functioning whole is less present than the story suggests. And when children are already abstracted, that absence becomes more noticeable. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If the goal is to protect children from exposure, why expose them at all? Why not remove them entirely from public storytelling? The answer, of course, is that the children are integral to the brand. They symbolize the stakes, the moral center, the justification for past decisions. Without them, the narrative loses gravity. So they must be present, but only on controlled terms. That balancing act is delicate, and delicate systems don't tolerate stress well. Which brings us to the staff. Because no matter how tightly you control outward-facing imagery, internal operations still have to function. People still have to execute the plan. And execution leaves traces. One of the most revealing shifts in this story isn't something that was said, it's who stopped appearing. Staff turnover is normal in high-profile households. Burnout happens, contracts end, careers move on. But when turnover clusters, it signals something else. It signals instability. People who work inside controlled environments are often the first to sense when the narrative they're supporting no longer aligns with reality. They notice when routines don't match expectations, when instructions feel disconnected from lived experience, when they're asked to maintain consistency around something that feels increasingly hypothetical. That tension wears people down. Several individuals who were once associated with the household are no longer there. They didn't speak out, they didn't give interviews, they just disappeared. And disappearance, in this context, is a form of communication. It suggests disengagement rather than conflict. Disengagement happens when people no longer believe they're part of something coherent. One former insider described it obliquely. It started to feel like maintaining a picture rather than supporting a life. That line is telling. Supporting a life is dynamic. Maintaining a picture is static. Static systems require constant energy to prevent change, which circles us back to that word again. Static. Neighbors used it to describe the house. Observers used it to describe the family rhythm. Now someone inside the operation uses it to describe the work. At this point, the question shifts yet again. It's no longer about whether the children exist. It's about where they exist within the structure being presented. Are they living, growing participants in a daily environment? Or are they primarily symbolic anchors in a controlled narrative? Those aren't mutually exclusive. But when one overwhelms the other, cracks form. And cracks are where people start to leave. What makes this especially precarious is timing. The increased reliance on controlled imagery coincides with other signs of pressure: legal maneuvers, shifting alliances, recalibrated messaging. When multiple systems begin tightening simultaneously, it usually means something underneath is unstable. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent. It means adaptation is underway, and adaptation often begins quietly, with increased control before it becomes visible. Which brings us back to the midnight departure again, because if the narrative around family life was already under strain, a sudden solitary movement at night doesn't read as random. It reads as part of a reconfiguration. Reconfiguration can take many forms: physical separation, legal preparation, emotional distancing. But whatever form it takes, it changes how the past is interpreted. Suddenly, the controlled images don't feel like protection. They feel like insulation. Insulation from scrutiny, from contradiction, from questions that don't have clean answers. And the more insulation is applied, the more heat builds underneath. That heat doesn't come from the public. It comes from the system itself. People inside it feel it first. And when enough of them step away, what's left behind becomes harder to sustain. It's tempting to treat silence as the absence of information, but in high-pressure environments, silence is often the loudest signal of all, especially when it's coordinated, especially when it persists. By the time neighbors were privately comparing notes, and the question about the children had crossed from unthinkable to unspoken, but shared something else was happening behind the gates, something far less visible than public appearances or curated photographs. People were leaving, not dramatically, not angrily, one by one, with no statements, no social media farewells, no whispered scandals, just exits. And in a household built on narrative control, exits are data. This chapter isn't about whistleblowers. There aren't any. Not yet. It's about what staff turnover looks like when the problem isn't interpersonal conflict, but structural strain. Because there's a difference between quitting a job and disengaging from a system. High-profile households always experience churn. That's not unusual. What's unusual is the pattern, the timing, the clustering, the absence of replacement visibility, and the way departures aligned with moments when the narrative itself appeared to tighten. People close to the situation described it not as chaos, but as compression. Everything narrowing. More rules, more protocols, more compartmentalization, less explanation. And when explanation disappears, people fill the gap themselves. Staff in these environments aren't passive. They observe, they learn patterns. They understand the difference between privacy and avoidance. They know when a household is simply guarded, and when it's actively managing inconsistencies. One former associate put it carefully, there's a point where you stop asking why and start asking how long. That's not the language of conflict. It's the language of endurance. Endurance becomes relevant when people feel they're being asked to maintain something that doesn't evolve, Or worse, something that doesn't exist in the way it's being represented. This is where non-disclosure agreements enter the story, not as villains, but as context. NDAs are standard in elite households. No one disputes that. They protect privacy. They prevent exploitation. They allow families to function without constant fear of exposure. But NDAs also shape behavior in quieter ways. They discourage questions. They incentivize compliance over curiosity. They create an environment where silence is safer than clarification. And when the expectations inside that environment begin to drift from observable reality, NDAs don't prevent doubt, they just prevent it from being resolved out loud. People don't confront. They withdraw. Several individuals who were once part of the Sussex orbit simply stopped appearing in professional contexts associated with the household. Their LinkedIn pages updated without comment. Their names vanished from schedules. Their roles dissolved. No announcements, no thanks. That kind of disappearance doesn't happen when people leave on good, clear terms. It happens when departures are easier than explanations. One source described the internal atmosphere during this period as hyper-managed, not chaotic, not tense in the traditional sense, just tightly controlled, schedules segmented. Information compartmentalized, fewer shared briefings, less informal overlap. That kind of environment can be efficient in a crisis, but it's exhausting when sustained, because efficiency without transparency erodes trust, and trust is the currency that keeps people in difficult jobs. When trust weakens, people stop investing emotionally. They do the minimum. They protect themselves. They look for exits that won't trigger questions. That's what this looked like. People didn't quit en masse. They peeled away. Each exit, on its own, was explainable. Burnout, opportunity, personal reasons. But together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore if you were paying attention, especially because those exits coincided with increased rigidity around certain topics. One former staffer alluded to zones, areas of life that were off limits even internally. Not just private, but sealed. Children's routines were among them. Not discussed, not referenced, not contextualized. That doesn't mean the children weren't there. But it does mean that even the people tasked with supporting the household weren't integrated into a shared understanding of daily life. That's unusual. In most family homes, staff understand the rhythms. They adapt around them. They know when kids nap, when school runs happen, when things are unpredictable. Here, unpredictability was absent. Everything was predictable because it was controlled. And control requires maintenance. The more controlled a system becomes, the less resilient it is. Small disruptions feel threatening. Questions feel destabilizing. People inside these systems sense that. They feel the fragility even when they don't understand its source. That's when people stop feeling like participants and start feeling like custodians of an image. And custodians burn out fast. One person who left described the work as keeping the frame intact. That phrase is revealing. A frame suggests a picture, a boundary, something that exists to hold an image in place. But life doesn't live inside frames. It spills. It pushes. It changes shape. When staff feel like their job is to prevent that change rather than support it, something has already gone wrong. This is where the story intersects again with the public narrative. At the same time staff were disengaging internally, the outward messaging became more deliberate. Fewer spontaneous moments. Increased reliance on symbolism over specificity. Children referenced as reasons, as motivations, but rarely as active participants in present tense life. That abstraction made internal work harder, not easier, because abstraction requires alignment. Everyone has to understand what the symbol stands for, and what it doesn't. When that understanding isn't shared, friction builds. People start asking themselves questions they can't ask anyone else. What exactly am I supporting here? What am I being asked not to notice? What happens if this changes suddenly? Those questions don't lead to confrontation. They lead to quiet exit strategies, and that's what we saw. Another telling detail. Replacements didn't arrive with the same visibility. In high-profile households, new staff usually overlap with old staff. Knowledge transfers. Roles are introduced. There's continuity. Here, continuity felt thinner, which suggests either a shrinking operation or one that was being deliberately simplified. Simplification is common during transition, and transitions rarely happen without cause. This is where we need to address something directly. There's a tendency, when discussing staff and NDAs, to assume someone is hiding wrongdoing. That's not the conclusion supported by the evidence here. What's suggested instead is narrative strain, a situation where the story being told externally requires increasing effort to sustain internally. That effort shows up as control. Control shows up as rigidity. Rigidity drives people away. No scandal needed. Just exhaustion. The most striking thing about the people who left is what they didn't do. They didn't leak. They didn't retaliate. They didn't correct the narrative. They simply disengaged. Disengagement is often more revealing than defiance, because defiance implies belief. Belief that speaking will change something. Disengagement implies resignation. Belief that speaking won't. That resignation doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates. Each unanswered question, each instruction that feels disconnected from lived reality, each moment when maintaining consistency becomes more important than acknowledging change, those moments stack. Eventually, people choose self-preservation, and when enough people make that choice, the system they leave behind becomes more fragile. Which brings us back once again to timing, the clustering of departures, the tightening of messaging, the midnight movement. These aren't isolated data points. They're converging ones. They suggest a household preparing for something, or bracing against it. Preparing could mean separation. Legal restructuring. Geographic reconfiguration. Bracing could mean containment, delay, preservation of a narrative that's under threat. Both involve planning, and planning requires fewer variables, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. When systems feel unstable, they often reduce complexity. They narrow circles, they limit exposure, they simplify roles, they focus on what can be controlled. People who don't fit into that simplified structure, or who ask questions that introduce uncertainty, tend to fall away. Not forcibly, organically. That's what appears to have happened here. And it matters because those people were once the connective tissue between the public narrative and the private reality. Without them, the gap widens. The story becomes easier to manage, but harder to believe. Which leads us to the next phase of this unfolding situation. Because when internal systems shed people, the pressure doesn't disappear. It relocates. It moves upward, into the relationship itself, into decision-making, into moments like leaving a house at midnight without explanation. Because when the scaffolding around a relationship begins to thin, what's left becomes visible. There's a moment in long relationships where the tension stops being emotional and starts being logistical. That's when things get quiet. Not calm, quiet. You stop hearing about arguments, you stop seeing visible conflict. What replaces it isn't harmony. It's separation of systems. Calendars drift. Advisors stop overlapping. Decisions get made in parallel instead of together. That's where this chapter begins. Not with rumors of divorce, not with headlines, but with the subtle reorganization of two lives that used to present as one. For a long time, the Sussex marriage has been framed as embattled but united. Every external pressure, media scrutiny, legal battles, institutional conflict, was positioned as something faced together. Against the world, against history, against injustice. That framing did a lot of work. It explained strain without implying fracture. It allowed difficulty without instability. But something has shifted recently, and it's not dramatic enough to trend on its own. It's procedural. Separate appearances started to feel less like scheduling conflicts and more like default modes. One shows up here. The explanations are plausible. They always are. Plausibility is not the same as cohesion. One observer described it as two people occupying the same story from different angles. That's a telling phrase. Because when couples are aligned, their narratives overlap naturally. Even when they're apart physically, the emotional through line is visible. References echo. Language syncs. Priorities align. Lately, that alignment feels thinner. Statements emphasize individual purpose rather than shared mission. Appearances reinforce autonomy rather than partnership. The language shifts subtly from we to I. None of this proves separation. Differentiation is a normal phase in relationships, unless it's happening under pressure. Pressure changes the meaning. And there is pressure here. Legal, reputational, logistical pressure. Which brings us back to the midnight departure, because it sits awkwardly in the middle of this pattern. Leaving quietly in the middle of the night doesn't read like a romantic gesture or a family decision. It reads like an operational one. Operational decisions are rarely made jointly in moments of emotional unity. They're made when coordination is necessary, but intimacy is strained. Let's talk about advisors. In high-profile relationships, advisors are the canaries in the coal mine. They don't create decisions, they prepare for them. They anticipate needs. They position options. Recently, observers have noted the appearance of advisors whose roles don't align with stability. Legal specialists, crisis planners, people who don't enter the picture unless contingency is being discussed. That doesn't mean divorce papers are filed. It means scenarios are being mapped. Mapping scenarios is what you do when the future is uncertain. And uncertainty is the enemy of narrative cohesion. One source described the situation as parallel processing, each side preparing independently for outcomes that may or may not converge. Parallel processing preserves flexibility. It also erodes unity, because once you start preparing separately, it becomes harder to present together convincingly. This is where the children re-enter the story, not as people, but as variables. In divorces, children aren't just emotional considerations. They're logistical ones: custody, residency, education, jurisdiction. And jurisdictions matter. California is not the UK. Privacy laws differ. Media norms differ. If there's even a remote possibility of separation, those differences become critical. You don't wait until a crisis to understand them. You prepare quietly, which could explain a lot of what we're seeing. The tightening of visibility, the abstraction of daily life, the avoidance of anchoring details that could complicate future arrangements. It could also explain why clarity hasn't been offered. Clarity locks you in. Ambiguity keeps options open. From a legal perspective, ambiguity is valuable. From a narrative perspective, it's destabilizing. That tension shows up in behavior. People begin to act cautiously. They limit overlap. They avoid commitments that imply permanence. They move at midnight. Another detail that's been noted by those watching closely is the absence of shared forward-looking plans. Not announcements, not initiatives, plans. When couples are stable, even under pressure, they project forward together. They tease future projects. They signal continuity. Here, the future feels segmented. Individual goals. That doesn't mean the marriage is over. It means it's being renegotiated. Renegotiation is not collapse, but it is a threshold. Crossing that threshold changes how everything else is interpreted. Neighbors noticing absence, staff disengaging, controlled imagery intensifying. All of it can be read as preparation rather than panic. Preparation for what exactly remains unclear. And that's the problem. Because when preparation becomes visible without explanation, people fill the vacuum with their own theories. This is where public perception becomes dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it accelerates timelines. Once divorce speculation takes hold, even quietly, it forces choices. Do you deny aggressively and risk exposure? Do you stay silent and let the narrative metastasize? Do you release partial truths and hope they hold? None of those options are good. So people often choose delay. Delay buys time. It also increases scrutiny. The longer ambiguity persists, the more people start interpreting neutral actions as signals. A separate appearance becomes evidence. A missing reference becomes meaningful. A quiet night becomes a turning point. That's what's happening now. And it's why the midnight departure resonated so strongly. It wasn't just a movement. It was a metaphor, a physical manifestation of separation without declaration. What's especially striking is how carefully conflict is being avoided publicly. No visible arguments, no leaks, no counter-narratives attacking each other. That restraint suggests mutual interest in controlling fallout. Control doesn't mean harmony. It means shared incentive. Shared incentive often exists even when relationships are ending, especially when reputations, children, and complex legal histories are involved. One person close to the situation described the relationship as cordial but compartmentalized. Compartmentalization is useful in business partnerships. It's exhausting in marriages. It requires constant emotional management, boundaries, rules, scripts. Scripts work until someone goes off script, and leaving at midnight without explanation feels like a script deviation. Not because it was reckless, but because it was visible. Even if no statement followed, the act itself broke pattern. It suggested urgency. Urgency suggests something tipped. What tipped is the question everyone's circling but no one's answering. Was this about space? Was it about advice? Was it about positioning? Or was it about something more final? We don't know yet. And that's intentional. Because whatever is happening, it's being managed carefully, incrementally, with an eye toward minimizing disruption. Minimizing disruption for whom is the real question? For the public, for the institutions involved, for the children, or for the individuals trying to preserve leverage in an uncertain future? Those motivations aren't mutually exclusive. They can coexist. But when they do, clarity is usually the first casualty. And clarity is what people crave when stories feel unstable. The absence of clarity doesn't